Okay, so good morning to this last class before a little bit of holidays. You know the next one will be on the 28th, 9, because we have all the week for. Okay, we have today, and then will be the Easter vacation, and then all the other days, and we'll continue. So we are starting today, and we continue on the 29th, the classes, and the next lab will be only the 2nd of May. Okay, so we have this big break here for Easter vacation. And today we are going to touch 3 topics. The first 2 are just quite small, and the third one is just the beginning of something that we will continue next time. We left over from last week the idea of having forms that can be controlled or uncontrolled. And last week we implemented a form using the controlled state pattern. Okay, so just a reminder, a form is controlled if every element has a bound value, so the value shown by the form control cannot be directly modified by the user, but is always forced by the current value of a state variable. And this state variable will be updated at every time the user is typing or clicking on something through an on-change event handler. So we have full control over what is displayed. Of course, we also have a full responsibility over updating the individual elements. And when it's time to submit the form, we already have all the data inside state variables. They can be many individual state variables. It could be just one state object with a lot of properties, but the idea is that it's already in the state of the component. The form is just displaying the state of the component. The other way around, where a form is uncontrolled, we just leave the control itself to evolve according to the browser implementation. So it's the browser who controls what the user can do with text inputs or checkboxes or whatever. So actually, during the interaction with the form, with the user interaction with the form, React is not involved. Okay, and this means that we are not forcing a value, so we cannot, in uncontrolled forms, we are not using the value attribute, we are not handling the change event normally. What we do is basically to set the default value, the starting value. Maybe they are empty, or maybe there's already some starting value inside the form, and then we let the control evolve according to the user input. And we just care about the moment in which the form is submitted. So we may have an onSubmit event or action attribute, which is more general than onSubmit on the form itself. So what you see is that there's no state in the React component, so the React component doesn't know what is currently being written in the form. It only can know it at submission time. At submission time, we have some information from the event, from the form itself, that collected the values for us. So actually, we let the browser do its work, and we just collect the data at submission time. And then, of course, we can do some error checking or validation and so on. But there's nothing to do in between. Working with uncontrolled component is a bit, it's not complex, but you need to care about several details, about the format of the data and so on. And that's why in recent version of React, they worked on a special hook that helps us in managing uncontrolled forms. It can also be used with controlled forms, but would be not very useful in that case. And this hook is called in React 19, so it only is available since last year, actually. It's called useActionState, and helps us to manage the submission action of an uncontrolled form. Okay. So if we don't want to use a control component, we prefer to use an uncontrolled component, we can have this useActionState deliver us some callbacks that help us manage the time, manage the state of the form itself. So again, remember, in this case, the state of the form is not inside the React state, it's just inside the HTML elements. So we're trying to manage them. What is this useActionState hook do? Well, it sits in between, actually, the form submission action and the real callback for managing the form data. Usually you have a form, okay? It can contain some information, okay? And all the onSubmit or the action attribute is specifying a function, no, that is called when the form is submitted. And usually this function is our responsibility, okay? So the function should do a lot of different tasks, validation and data storage and rebuilding the data to show in the form, maybe also displaying error messages and so on. Okay? The useActionState, as I said, sits in between. In this very simple form, the action to do when the form is submitted is actually to call this increment function. So normally, in a fully uncontrolled form, I would have action equal to increment. With useActionState, we call the hook useActionState, and this hook receives as an argument the function to be called when we want to submit the form. Okay? So I implement a function that does what I need to do with my data, and I call useActionState by providing it the reference to this function. And what does useActionState give me in return? It gives me three variables. One is called form state, form action, and is pending. The second one, form action, is the action that should really be called by the form. So it delivers a function that is designed to be called at the submission time of the form. So actually what happens is then when the user submits the form, actually the browser will call form action, which is not my function, it's being created by the hook. And then the implementation of this form action function will call my actual handler. So it sits in between the user clicking on submit and my handler running, and does some homekeeping, basically. It also provides me one variable, form state, that is the current value of a state. So in a sense, it's managing and sharing with the controls of the form the current state of the elements. Okay, so I can always use this form state for populating the user interface, for example. It shows me the last value that is being submitted or the initial value that is being defaulted, actually. And we see that from examples. And the last one is the more interesting one, but we cannot understand that today, is the pending state. And it's very useful when the actions associated with the form, for example, the submission of new data, needs to be managed asynchronously. So maybe by sending data to a server. So right now, when we click on submit, we are immediately manipulating the state. So actually, it's a synchronous operation. But when the data will be stored in a server, what happens is that when the user clicks on submit, we start calling a remote API, and we need to wait until this remote API is completed before we update the user interface. So there will be a state, a time interval in which the request, in which the form submission is pending. We are handling it. And this could take maybe visible fractions of a second. Okay, so this is where the useActionState hook is really useful for managing this time. Maybe while the submission is pending, we need to disable the user interface. We don't want the user to click many times on the same button because the operation is ongoing. Okay, and all of this is automated because this pending value becomes true when the operation is in progress and becomes false again when the operation is completed. And it will help us a lot in handling actually the user interface. Without this hook, we had to do all of this by hand. Okay, so I set a state when they start the remote call, I set another state when the call is pending, and then when it's finished, and so on. And a lot of stupid logic, just for handling these different advancement states of the request. Okay, we'll come to that when we do actually the integration between the client and the server, and when this will turn out to be very useful. For now, it's not useful at all because the increment or the handler actually does some very quick and nearly synchronous operations. It sets a local state. Okay. One detail, since this useActionState is designed, okay, to manage remote data, the event handler is always an asynchronous function. Okay. Right now, we are just, in our handler, we are just calling set states, so it doesn't need to be, but it's designed to be asynchronous so that inside we can call a remote function, we can wait for the response to come and so on, inside an async function. So it's designed to be async. So, we have, to learn how to use this, if we choose to go this way, okay, it's just a choice, we are not forced to do that. There are two different points. Okay, one is the hook itself that creates, that manages the state, and the other is the, let's say, handler for the submission itself. The handler function receives two arguments. One is a sort of a previous state and is expected to return an updated value of state. So actually this action function can be called many times. Imagine when you are submitting a form, trying to submit a form, and then you have some validation error. So you don't go ahead with submission, but maybe you correct some data or you add some error messages. Okay, all these error messages will be in the state of the form. Maybe they are initially hidden, but then after that you will display them. Okay, so the idea is that every time the user tries to submit, the action function, the handler, is called. It gets the form data, okay, the data that is being submitted, and it can return a set of state variables. Normally this state is an object that contains many properties, from which the form can be rebuilt and rebuilt again every time we need to refine it or to correct some missing data and so on. And finally, of course, at the end we will decide to actually proceed with the submission. So this action function receives a previous value of the state and can return an updated version of the state. And it receives the current form data. So actually, the previous state is just a memory from myself. This argument, previous state, has a very simple life. First is set to the second argument of the hook, so the initial state. The hook itself has a first argument as the callback function, and the second is the initial value. So this previous state is set initially to the initial value, to the default value. And then every time this function is called, this previous state is set to the return value of the previous call of this function. So that we go instead. We remember the previous value and we may update it. Okay? So it's a variable where we can store whatever we need and we can update it. And we can use it maybe for generating the values in the form. And the second argument is the actual values typed by the user, okay, which are more recent than the state. Form data is not just a simple object, it's not a simple JavaScript object, but it's a reference to an object in the browser API. Okay, it's a form data object. This means that the properties cannot directly accessed by the dot notation. You must use a get method that makes it a bit more complex. Simply, let's try to modify, to have an idea, and then modify our form to become uncontrolled and managed by the action state. Okay, so imagine a simple form for submitting a name. Okay, so so we don't have the asynchronous behavior, so we don't have any is pending. The third function is not needed for us. What we are doing is that we create a form, and we set the action of this form to the function returned by the hook. So we call the hook, we get the function form action, and we set it as the action for form submission. And we also have a state. Before it was called the previous state. Okay, the state variable that is initialized with whatever object I pass as a second argument. So actually we have a state that I initialize with a simple argument name, a simple object, sorry, with a property name equal to a prop. And how to use this state? We can use it to set the initial value of the HTML controls. So I have a prop. The prop goes into the default value of the state. It's not a real state, no? It's the action state. It's not a use state, this one. And this set the initial value of the state variable. We can use it maybe for populating the form. So this is how we set the initial value, if we need it. Then the user can type and do whatever it wants. Sooner or later, we'll click on the submit button. At this point, the form action is called, but really, for the form action will call a handler submit, which is my async handler, which is here on the left, that will take the form data and extracts information submitted and present in the form. So the way I get the value of this input form is asking to the form data object to get the value of the element called name in this case. So with the name, and then we can do whatever we want. The async, the handler should return the updated value of the state. So in this case, it's a way for updating this state variable that we had here. In this case, in this example, it's not useful because we are not using this object anywhere else. Only in the default value, and the default value is only used once at the beginning, so we are not reading it again. But maybe we want to show it somewhere else or however we want. Okay, we are taking data from the form data and saving, if you say so, inside the state if we need it. This state is just a utility state for us to store some variables that we may need to manage the form. For example, error messages. I return an error message, and then the render code will display the error message in the right point. Okay, how does it work in our example? So what I did was to, let's increase the font as usual. I made a copy of the exercise from last week, from week 7, into a QA client in week 8. So we have the exact copy. And we could go into the, where's that? Sorry, at the bottom, we had this add edit answer form, which was a controlled component, controlled form. We could try to transform it into an uncontrolled component. it's something which is just a local modification. We don't need to modify or we shouldn't need to modify or touch any other component in this application. Okay? So let me just make a copy of this function, just not to write it from scratch, and call it maybe u, like uncontrolled. Oh, let's not be uncontrolled, like that. And the other one, I can rename it to _controlled. And the way, in the place where we are using the form, where we are calling the form, which is here, we try to use the uncontrolled form, which for the moment is just the same, so it should work as before, but then we start modifying it. Okay? So we have the two versions side by side to compare. Let's try to run it, so that at the same time okay, the console. Okay, here we are. Okay. Okay, so more or less it's working like before. Okay, so what are the modifications or the changes in our uncontrolled form component? Where is it? Uncontrolled. Okay, from here home. First of all, we don't need the state anymore. We don't need to create state variables. So let me just comment them for the moment. And also we don't need to have all these update functions to micromanage the state. It is something that the browser is already able to do. The submit answer is something that we will keep. Let me collapse for a moment, which is the real logic of the application. Let's first focus on the form management. So we drop the state, and so we can drop all the value and on-change events from the controls. The one and the second one was here, value and on-change. So this makes these two form controls, uncontrolled in the React speaking. So they can do whatever they want. Of course, we also had a text variable that is no longer available, so let's comment this for a moment. So if I save this, what happens is that I have some elements where I can do whatever I want. They are not controlled anymore. If I have a look at the component tree, we see that the now form has some properties, but it doesn't have any state. The props, but you see there are no state variables here, and actually if I just inspect this component, I don't know what is written here. Okay? So now, the form, but here I have the limit of 10 characters. How can I do that? I can imagine that. Okay, I can ask the browser for help. For example, in HTML, we could do something like limiting the length of names. So, for example, we have a max length attribute. In HTML, we set it to 10, and the browser should prevent me. Yes, I can't go any further. The browser already prevents me for entering more than 10 characters. So I'm relying more on the mechanism inside the browser by instructing the form component to behave in a given way, without needing to check it myself character by character. Okay, so that's one possibility. If I want to to enforce some behavior. Of course, it depends on what the HTML component is able to do. And so until submission, I don't need to do anything. You see that I removed everything, and they can still fill my form. Now, what happens when I click on submit? When I click on submit in this new way, I should implement an action active at the form level that will be called automatically at the submit action, in which I will specify let's take it from the slides as an example, the form action function. Where is this form action coming from? From the hook. So I need to call the state form action. We don't have the pending state yet, but we can just start declaring it. Use action state from React. Okay, and so we have this hook is generating for us the function to be called at submission time. And what is this function doing? Well, its own job, plus it will call my handler. My handler will be this submit answer function, or a modification of this submit function. Okay? So I could put here as a first argument submit answer as a function. Of course, it doesn't work because it should be defined before, so I should just swap these two statements. Submit answer is not defined yet here because defined in the next line. So let me move this declaration just below. The important thing is that all the hooks calls are at the top level. I should never put a use statement for a hook inside an if or inside a for, because otherwise the React will not be able to keep track of which use of the continuity of your hook states across different function calls if in every function call you are calling a variable number of hooks. So the important thing is that the hooks are always called at the top level of the function, so there will be always the same exact sequence of hook calls. So hook call number 1 will always refer to the same object. But we can have it after the time declaration. And we have a second argument that should be the initial state, the initial value of the state. Let's see if we need this state. Okay, what modification do we need to do on our handler? Well, first of all, the signature, it doesn't receive just the event from the browser, it's already received two data, which is the previous state and the form data. And this is an asynchronous function. So these are the two modifications. And so inside, inside the body of this submission, we don't need to call prevent default because it's already being checked by the action. So we just need to focus on the data. And what we are receiving is this form data, from which we can extract the values that we need. For text, you see that text and email are no longer states, are no longer global states, component states, sorry. So they don't exist anymore, but we can extract them from the form data. So text is a form data dot get me the value of the form whose name is text, and the same for email, form data get give me the email. So I'm just going in this moment at submission time to read what we have in the form, what the user wrote in the form. okay, so I don't need to do these sets again. Okay. So what is happening here? Let me reload the application. So we just modified, we took the data that we want to save or edit from the form data instead of from the state. So we are, let's say, relying on the component to own the state. And we can try to enter something, and it works. Okay? In this case, it worked. It added something that can be, of course, managed. Okay? So for adding new stuff, it's already working. Adding new stuff because we don't need oh, sorry. We need, okay, this is the normal validation of the browser. We can add information and so on. What is not working is the edit functionality, or at least it looks like it's working, but it doesn't pre-fill the form. Okay, so if I click on edit for the first elements, it actually says I try to edit number, so the form knows that it receives edit current number 20, and the where are you? The form actually has the editing property that contains the answer that I want to edit. But this is not being transferred into the default values on the form elements. Okay, so we should manage that. If I try to save, it will delete the data. Okay. So, but it looks like a problem of the default value of these form elements. In fact, we don't have any default value here in our components. Okay, they start empty. So if we want to preload them with the value of the property, we could set it here. So let's try to set the default value to props.editing.text. Let's try with this one. Props.editing is undefined. Okay, if is defined, okay. Okay, so if props.editing is not defined, just put it nothing, so it's uninitialized. If it's defined, that extract the text property. I'm using the nullish access operator. And the same can be done with this email. Editing, if editing is defined, then extract the email property. So for example, I go here, I change this email, and it's updates. Okay, so this is what is working with an empty editing component that for using for add, or with an editing property which is already defined, and we use it as an initial value. Okay, so this can be one possibility. We are just setting the state at the beginning with the props of the component when it's being created. Okay. This is the simple. You see that we are not using at all this state for the moment. Okay, because we are not incrementally validating or evolving the content of the form. Otherwise, just imagine that we want to do something stupid, like, I don't know, capitalize the text. Okay, everything should be uppercase or something like that, or remove the spaces or whatever you want. Okay, so we should maybe iterate over. When you submit, we can modify it and then return and iterate and so on. And in that case, the value should not be just bound to the initial value, but should, in a way, update. Okay. So in this case, we should work with the state variable by providing an initial state. So we provide a second attribute here, a second argument here, with initial state that could be maybe an empty answer or the answer currently being edited, for example. So that will be the initial state of our form. So the idea is, for example, we define an empty answer new answer. Remember, the empty answer, we have the ID, which is undefined, because it's not used, undefined. Then we have the text, which is an empty string, the image is an empty string, the user ID undefined for the moment, and the date also, we don't need it, because it will be computed later, and score is 0, for example. And so we say, okay, if we are in editing mode, then we can use this object, because that will be the initial value. Or, if we are not in editing mode, we can use the empty answer. So we are using an OR for a default value. So if props.editing is defined, we use that as initial state. Otherwise, we use the default value, which is an empty answer, for example. So in this case, we can manage the evolution of the state. So we are this value, this expression here, okay, is stored into this variable state, and we can use it inside. So inside of prop.editing.text, which is just the default value, you can write state.text. And here also, state.email. So for the moment, it should work in the same way, I hope. So if I write something, no. What's wrong? State is undefined in 166. State dot, sorry, it's a capital T, lowercase t. But state is not undefined because it's defined here. Why are you telling me that props.editing, if it's true, if it's false, it goes to enter? Yes, it should be working. Why don't you like me? State is undefined. Yes, sorry. Yep, of course. Is the evolution of the form. Okay. So I was able to submit the form. Okay. The submission called the add answer, but this event handler should return a new value of the state. Okay. So if for me the state, which is managed by the action state, is an answer object, this function does not return anything, so actually it returns an undefined object. And that is the reason of my error, okay? After the submission is called, the previous state is replaced with the return value of this function, which is undefined because it didn't return anything. Okay, so for example, what I could do is to return an empty answer. And this would clear the form after the element has been added. And also in the other case, I can also return the empty answer that will empty the form. So in this case, let's try again. Okay, we see that it's working now as before, and now the form has been cleared. And it has been cleared thanks to this instruction, return empty answer. Otherwise, if I wanted to preserve the current value, I should return a value that has been created, for example, the new answer. Let's just try it for understanding how it works. If I return a new answer here in an add operation, what you see that is when I submit, the answer is of course added to the list, but this value is kept here, because the return value of the handler is just used for updating the form. Now I'm just confirming what was already there, but I could also manage it or can also change it. And as I said, if I want to show an error message, I just have to add something to this state. When I return it, I will have a property, error1, with a message, and in the code generating the form, I just have to check whether you have the state of error, then display it, for example. Okay? So this is a different way of managing, so return the empty answer so that it behaves. These two behave in the same way, they just are based on storing managing the state explicitly or letting it to the browser to manage. What we cannot do is this one. Remember, you had this counter of the number of characters. We could try to do a state.text.length, for example, for showing the, state.text contains the previous value, and we don't have the variable text anymore, but we replaced it with state.text when we needed it. But if we try it, we see that this number never changes. You see, it says 8, I'm changing the field, but it still stays 8. Because it's being computed when the form has been created from the initial value, or from the component creation. For example, let's delete something, and so let me reload the application. It starts with 0, and it keeps being 0. Because this state is updated, of course, but it's only updated at submission time. It's only updated here. It's not updated as before at every keystroke. So this kind of behavior cannot be obtained with uncontrolled forms. We should have, of course, I can have a non-change event and keep track separately of another state that we can update, but at that point, it would be better to have a control component. So it depends on the level of fine control that you want. If you want this kind of real-time validation behavior, maybe it's better to have a control component. If you just have submission, maybe you can just rely on uncontrolled component. But both ways, they actually do the same thing. The important thing, just to mention, is that we didn't modify at all the parent component, and we didn't modify practically at all the logic for submission, nor the callback that is used to modify the data. It's just the way in which you decide to implement that specific component, and the other components around it don't need to know anything. Yep. Okay, so that was the first point for today. The second point is something easy that you can manage in the 20 minutes that we have before the break, is called where's the folder here? Context. Context is another set of features of React that will help us to more easily share some state variable that is generally useful or should be generally available. So what we already saw is that in many cases we need to replicate some property down and down through different set of components, so drilling down the component to bring some value to the component that needs it. Okay? But that could be some set of properties, some states, some information stored in some state that is useful for every component in your application, all of them. So in theory, you should put these properties to all the components, to the children, the subchildren. For example, the color scheme of your application is a dark or light mode. Every component should know that. Okay, you may solve it with CSS, but if you need to adapt something, every component should potentially know about this information. Or the language. If you have a multilingual website, is it in Italian, in English, or whatever? Every component that generates a piece of text should know that information. More interestingly, the currently logged in user. So in a lot of places, you should render differently a part of the page, whether the user is logged in or not, and if it's logged in, maybe who is his identity, who is his name, what is his name, and so on. So there's some information that should be globally available or generally available to all the components. And we don't want the burden to pass around all these properties. Okay? This is what context is for. We have a state defined in a component, and we want to have a mechanism for teleporting this state value to all the children, of course, that needs it, who are interested to that, without passing through every single layer of components. Okay? So we are not, it's not a different type of state, it's just a different mechanism for passing the state. How does it work? Well, it works with a special object, which is called a context object. It's created by this called createContext. And this context object creates an object, of course, that contains two properties. An object with a property called provider and a property called consumer. We are not going to use the consumer too much, but actually you can use the hook that will access the consumer. So createContext creates the two, let's say, sides of the portal. One side where we can inject a value, and the other side when the value can appear instantaneously on the other side. Differently from a portal, a context has one input and many outputs. So when something enters, since it's read-only, we can do that. It appears in many different places. It's not just one-to-one teleporting, so it's advanced teleporting. So we create a new object of type context, and we must set the value, the initial value of this context object that normally replicates a real state, a real application state. And then we can use the value by subscribing, okay, use the current value like it was a local state or like it was a local property. So, for example, let's do the example of set in the language of the application. So imagine, of course, the current language could be Italian or English and should be stored in a state variable, and nothing new. So inside app, we need to create a state, and this state we should store the current language. Okay. And we have, of course, a handler to toggle the language. So if it was Italian, it becomes English, and vice versa. Regular stuff. Okay. And we have a button for toggling the language and so on. So this is just normal. It's just a single component. But then this component will instantiate a lot of children, and all these children should know about the current value of the language. Okay? So for doing that, we create a mechanism for transporting the current value into all the children that are interested. And this is the context that should be created. Normally, it's created in a separate file. Why is it created in a separate file? Just because this object, language context, is just one line, create context. This object should be visible to the elements in app, plus all the code in the other components. We should ensure that the object, the language context object, is created only once, but the same object is visible many times. So we put it in a separate file. The first time the file is imported, the code is run. All the other types, the code is imported, we just access through the export the previous object. So we only have one context object created, and the reference to this object is being imported in all the components that need it. So that's why we tend to have it in a separate file and importing this file into our code. Okay, now we create, this just creates the tunnel. Now we must link the input and the output of the tunnel to the actual state variable. Putting something inside the context is done by the provider component. The provider component is a Reactor component, so you just instantiate that in JSX with the brackets, which has a value property, and the value is the value that you are injecting into the context pipe. Normally, this value would be a copy of a local property, or most likely a copy of a local state. So in our case, we had this state variable called the language from before. We create a provider, so we use the context, and we inject into the context the current value of the state language. And we are wrapping all the application inside this context provider. So this context is being provided to every child or transitive child of this component inside here. And every component here that queries about the language context will receive the current updated value of the state. So this for feeding the context. And for using the context, there are two ways. One is not much used because it creates a consumer object, but it's a easier one that uses the useContext hook that simply makes the current value available inside a function, inside any component. So this component called display should be a child or a grandchild of a language.provider, and it can, in any case, in any moment, extract the current value through the useContext hook by providing as an argument the context object that we created. Okay? And so we can use this value as it was a local state or as it was a local property. So we treat it as read-only, and we know that whenever this value changes, all my component is rendered again. So we can fill the rule that the component is re-rendered when the props change, when the state changes, or when the context changes. which is actually a sort of a window of a state. Okay, in our case, in our application, if we want to test this, we can imagine, for example, adding a language switch, okay, in our application. So at the top level, we add this question and answer, which is the real application state, but we also have some context state. In our case, it will be just the language. Language, set language, would be just a variable, a normal state. Let's say English for the beginning. And then we may have a handler functions. For managing the language. Yeah, but okay, so it's just a toggle language, for example. It's just a simple callback that set lang. Then we hold the lang. We are updating based on the current value, so we should always create a callback. If old lang was English, then return Italian, otherwise return English. Question mark here. Something like that. Okay? So we can add this to, for example, the header component. We have an header somewhere. Where's my browser? Okay, for example, in the navigation bar, we can add a component here that shows a button that shows the current language, and we can toggle it. So it's in the header component. So it means that we must pass, and this was easy, to the header, the language, and toggle language. So we are right now we didn't use the context yet. Okay, we go inside header, and we may have a different, a very stupid thing. Is a button, for example. An action of not a form action, it's just an action. Oh, sorry, on click equal to props dot toggle language, and the value in the button will be the language. Let me see if it works. Props.language. Okay, it's a button here. Okay. I didn't think it worked the first time, but I'm lucky today. Okay, so here we have it, but only this component knows about it. We want, for example, to modify all these messages, add new answer, question number, and so on, according to the language. And so every component should know about it. That is why we can create a context. We can create a language context file. And we create a language context object by react dot create context. The initial value could be, for example, English And this initial value, this default value is only used if you don't inject anything into the tunnel. So there should always be something on the other side. Of course, React should be imported. Just import. Yep. And then we export this object, language context. We do this only once, okay? If we had many different context objects, we can have all of them in the same file. Of course, we need to export them not as a default value, but as an object. And on the other hand, we should import the language context from language context here, okay? And this is not already a component. It is an object that contains the component, the provider component, that we can use in our code. So we can wrap our entire application into a language context .provider, and we are providing a context called language with the current value of the state variable lang. So whenever the state variable lang changes, our context is updated and all the children can fill the update like this. Let's fix the indentation, okay? So, and we are done from the provider side. We created the context, we injected into the context transport a value. So every time the value changes for any reason, and in this case, just when we toggle the button, the context is updated. So imagine we are going now deep into some component, maybe the answers component, okay? When we add some text, for example, in the rendering, so let's see, this text here, add new answer, is inside the form, really 5 or 6 levels deep. But we need to customize this message, for example. Okay? So we go to our uncontrolled form component that we just played with, and we need to modify this message. Okay, it's already complex because but we can do that. No? Okay, maybe we can pull it out from this rendering. We define a variable and we manage this variable. But first of all, we should know about the current language. Okay, so how to do that? Well, it's quite easy because at this point we just need to import the language context from yeah, and we are down into the uncontrolled component. We just can extract the current value of the language from the current context object, language context. So now we have this value, language, that we can use. Just to see it, we can show, for example, here, just the variable. So in this case, you see that it's Italian, it will show IT in the corner, and it will change automatically. Okay, so we must, of course, we must ensure that this form component that needs it is nested inside the provider. So it should be a grandchild of the provider, but then after that we can just pick the value and use it when we need it. And only the component, maybe the intermediate components don't need it, but the final one does. Okay, so that's just the mechanism. So, and right now we can say, okay, the message that we want to display is just, okay, if we have a normal message that should be in maybe in English, for example, and if language, this is just normal code, language is equal to Italian, then we change the message to the same expression, but aggiungi una risposta, oppure modifica la risposta, for example, and here we adjust this message. So in this case, okay, nothing fancy, but just convenient. Okay, don't abuse context, don't just put context for everything so that you can forget about giving properties, because context is a sort of a global variable. So it prevents you from using the same component with different properties, because you are bypassing completely the properties. And so if you're trying to reuse it, it will always pick one single context. Another thing that you can do, this was the easy version in which the context only contains the current value. And if you need to change the value, you need to have, like we did here, a toggle function. And that can be, maybe you can only pass it to the components that you want to modify your state, for example. But if, on the other hand, if you want every component for some reason to be able to modify it, it's not a problem. You just, when you create the state, instead of just having a string type state, you could have, for example, a complex state, like, let me write it as an example. An object that's called, okay, the language is English, and the toggle is toggle language function. So you can, sorry, semicolon. So you can create a state variable which contains the state itself and the handler function, and you pass that into the context. I don't like it very much, because every time I update the state, I should also update also the other components, okay, all the toggle function. But this means that I'm not forced, actually, to have all the handler inside the object. I could, so it can be done, but it makes more complex to update the state. The other possibility would be just to pass this into the value of the provider. So the alternative would be here. The value of the provider is not just a variable language, but it's an object that contains the value and also the method for updating this. Actually, instead of just a string, we pass an object that contains the value, and the object, sorry, it's not English here, is just lang. An object that replicates the state. Every time the state changes, of course, this object is re-evaluated and then is propagated as a context variable. If we want to provide, if we want to provide also the method for changing it, we just wrap it into an object. So it's an alternative. Let's put it as a and comment that. Okay, otherwise I have to modify language.language in the component that uses it. Okay, so you can do actually whatever you want. You are not forced just to insert a single state into a context, but also a complex object that contains more state variables maybe, and the object for modifying that. For example, when we use the context, we're going to use the context for ending user login and logout. Of course, the information will be the full information about the user, not the password, but the ID, the name, the email, and so on. That should be available to everybody. So it will not be just a single state. Okay, let me check if it's still working, because there's always the risk. Okay, and then we edit this. Okay, it looks like it's working also. Yeah. Okay, so that's bring us to the break, right? And after the break, we are starting another topic, which is a bit longer, which how to create an application that has more pages. Okay, for example, just to have as a spoiler, and right now we have only one page in our application, the answers. But ideally, you should have a home page, a list of questions, for every question, a list of answers, and so on. We could do that with tricks like the mod variable. Okay, the mod edit or mod insert could become mod display question, mod display answer, and have a lot of ifs in our code, depending on the general mod, do some choice about which components they want to show. We will learn about the React router, which is a general mechanism for handling all of that, and so having different pages in the same application. React creates a so-called single page application. We load the page only once, and then we just mangle the components. But if we want to have the impression of having different pages to navigate through, what we do in React is to create different routes, and every route will render different components. But that's for after the break in 15 minutes. Okay?